Hello everyone. It is time for a new history talk, and in this video I'm going to tell you the story of the California gold rush in the 19th century. We will see how in just a few years an underpopulated and forgotten region of the world has become a synonym for dreams of quick wealth. We will see how it has undergone a massive demographic and economic boom with global consequences, how the hamlet of San Francisco turned into a city in just a few months, where the name 49ers comes from, and many more things. So it's now time for you to adopt a comfortable position. You may close your eyes, you just need to open your ears, and we're going to relive this amazing human adventure, full of dust, sweat, pain, and dreams, under the sun of California. Our story begins in the 1840s, when California was not a part of the US yet, but a former Spanish colony that now belonged to Mexico. You know that in the 1810s and until the beginning of the 1820s, the Spanish colonial empire in America fell apart. Various countries declared their independence, and Mexico was the largest of these newly independent countries. But it was twice its current size, because it also included a vast territory from Texas to California that was very scarcely populated. In 1836, Texas declared its independence, and later on a majority of its population wanted to join the US. And in 1846, a war began, the Mexican-American War, between the US and Mexico. The US Army occupied these territories, and when the peace was signed in 1848, Mexico abandoned them to the US. It is only slightly later, in 1850, that the state of California will be founded. In between, it will remain a territory attached to the US and occupied by the army. And it is during this period when California remains in some sort of legal void, in 1848 and 1849, that the gold rush is going to begin. There was very little population in California back then, probably something around 500,000, the vast majority of them being Native Americans. Their number are estimated to be somewhere between 100,000 and 700,000. It's very difficult to estimate. And the others, only a few thousand persons, were settlers coming from Mexico, the US, or straight from Europe. There was little interest back then for California from the rest of the world. Even though its climate was favorable, the region looked very remote for Europeans, for Americans too. By land, you had to cross the Rocky Mountains, which was complicated and potentially dangerous. By the sea, it was not much easier. The Panama Canal did not exist yet, so you had to make a very, very long journey, almost a complete turn of America, by sailing south to the Cape Horn, south of Argentina and Chile, and then north on thousands and thousands of additional miles before you arrived to the shores of California. This started to change in 1848, in January 1848, when the first gold discovery took place. It was on the land of a Swiss settler, a man called John Sutter. John Sutter's life looks like a novel almost, and actually it inspired several books. But what we need to know for our story is that on his land that he was trying to develop, he had ordered the construction of a sawmill on the American River. And one of the carpenters found pieces of a shiny metal in the river. He presented his find to John Sutter, and the two men quickly realized that this was gold. Initially, Sutter wanted to keep the discovery secret, not really to keep all the gold for himself, but because his plans were for the development of a farm on his land, and he was afraid that if the news started to spread out, there would be a massive inflow of people coming to his land and destroying his projects. And actually, he couldn't be more right, because this is exactly what happened in the following years, and John Sutter was finally ruined by the gold rush when people came to his land, killed or stole his cattle, destroyed everything he had built, and even attacked his property right on the land. Despite his initial efforts, the news started to spread very quickly. In March 1848, it was already known in San Francisco, which back then was not even a town, it was just a small village with something like 500 to 1,000 inhabitants only. And in August 1848, the news had reached the East Coast. It was published in a New York newspaper. A few weeks later, the news was officialized in a message to the Congress, the American Congress, so that everything was now in place in December 1848 for the real gold frenzy to begin. This gold rush to California was not the first in history. It was not the last neither. There would be another one a few years later to Australia. But this is the first that took place on a global scale. Due to the relative acceleration in communications, the news spread to Europe a few weeks later, to Asia too, and from the entire world, the east of the US, South America, all European countries, even China. Thousands and thousands of adventurers, miners, started to converge towards California. Of course, prior to their arrival, the rush had already begun with the local population. It is said that when the news reached San Francisco, the little town almost became a ghost town overnight. People abandoned their boats, their shops, their houses to go to the American River and start looking for gold nuggets in the water. And especially in 1848, when it all began, they found a lot of gold in some of the Californian rivers. The presence of gold in the region can be explained by plate tectonics, the volcanic activity and the erosion as well. You know that California is at the meeting point of two plates. There is an oceanic crust that passes under the continental American plate, and this oceanic crust is very rich in minerals, including gold, that have been brought here by underwater volcanoes. When the oceanic crust passes under the continental American plate, it becomes liquid, and the volcanoes on the continent bring the liquefied minerals closer to the surface. Then, after million years of rainfall and wind erosion, the gold veins may appear at the surface, and eventually nuggets can be separated from the rock by the erosion and follow the rivers where the first gold seekers found them. In 1849, with the arrival of a massive wave of immigrants coming from the entire world, the rush took a brand new dimension. Before they reached California, they had to make a very long and dangerous journey. About half the immigrants arrived by land from Mexico for some of them, but the majority came from the east coast of the US, crossing the Middle West and the Rocky Mountains by horse or just walking in a trip that could last several months. Another route was by the sea, and there were two options: entirely by the sea, sailing south to the Cape Horn and then north to California, or crossing America in Panama. The Panama Canal did not exist yet. It would be built only a few decades later, but what travelers could do was to arrive on the Caribbean coast of Panama, cross the land, and take another boat on the Pacific coast to continue their journey to California. When they arrived in 1848 and 49, the miners tried to settle as fast as possible on a section of a river that they claimed for themselves and where they would start looking for gold. Remember that during this period there was very little legal structure in California. The region was occupied by the US military, but very lightly. In total there was something like 1,000 soldiers only. At the scale and given the size of California, this is nothing. So legally the situation was very chaotic, and obviously the rates of crime and mortality were very high among the miners. It is estimated that in total about 1 out of 12 miners died because of crime and abnormal mortality due to this dangerous environment. The risk was high, but so could be the payoff. For example, in 1848, a small group of men who worked on a section of the Feather River found for almost $1.5 million worth of gold. To convert to modern dollars, given the erosion in the value of the currency, you have to multiply by 25. It means close to $40 million of today's dollars that just a few men had to share between them as a result of a few months, even a few weeks of work. People say sometimes that it is the businessmen, the merchants, that made the biggest profit from the gold rush and not the miners. It is true that some businessmen accumulated considerable wealth thanks to the gold rush by providing clothes, equipment, food to the miners and the immigrants that arrived in California with some money to spend. But this should be mitigated too. Many businessmen lost everything they had, and supplying the miners could also be a very dangerous kind of business. Sometimes there was a rumor saying that gold had been found at a particular place, so immediately people flocked to this destination. Someone decided to invest in opening a shop at the location, and finally no significant discovery was made, meaning that everybody disappeared, and the owner could found his shop completely useless and lose everything he had invested. The prospection intensified so quickly that by 1850 almost all the gold that could be easily accessed had been already discovered and collected, and new techniques were implemented, sometimes coming back to a more traditional form of mining by digging, looking for gold veins. There was also in the 1850s various individual who arrived to California just with his intention to work and his dreams of wealth to really make it financially. Bit by bit, the miners were regrouping to rationalize the search for gold. Companies started to appear, and on the legal side, things were increasingly organized. I told you earlier that the state of California was founded in 1850. It became the 31st state of the United States, and a legal environment started to be put in place in a state where, prior to this, there was very little public services or any kind of regulation or protection of private property. The rush had a massive economic impact on California and the rest of the world to a lesser extent. In California, because the miners had to be supplied with everything they needed: housing, food, entertainment, and imports to California coming from Asia, from Europe, from the eastern part of the US grew dramatically in this period, helping to stimulate the economy of various other regions around the Pacific or in Europe. And so did the inflow of precious metal. The gold found in California was quickly exported. It served to pay for all the supplies that reached the state, and this inflow of gold in other parts of the world inflated the quantity of available money. It stimulated investment and brought more momentum to the economy in general. From 1848 to the mid-1870s, there was a long period of economic expansion, a bit like in the 1950s and 1960s. The gold rush may have been just one reason, among others. There was also the acceleration in the construction of railways, technical innovations, but it helped the world economy to grow slightly faster and benefited the entire world. The population in California increased dramatically during the rush. It is estimated that in total about 300,000 immigrants arrived during the 7 years of the gold rush from 1848 to 1855, even though the best years probably are the 2 or 3 first ones, when it was possible for a miner to make it and make it big financially when he arrived in California. These 300,000 immigrants have to be compared with just the 15,000 that were living in California before the rush. But on the other hand, the Native American population was decimated by the rush or during the rush, suffering from diseases, losing their land, and their population dropped very quickly, to the point that by the end of the century it had not entirely disappeared, but it had been reduced to a few thousand persons. The city of Sacramento was founded during the rush by one of the sons of John Sutter. You remember him, he was the settler who was the first to discover gold in the American River on his land, and the city that benefited the most from the rush probably was San Francisco. As I said before, San Francisco was just a hamlet with 500 to 1,000 persons before 1848. By 1850 it already had 25,000 inhabitants, and 15 years later, when the rush was finished and the economy in California had already begun to diversify, San Francisco had 150,000 inhabitants. During the 19th century, actually, it was the most important city in California. It's only in the 20th century that the metropolitan area of Los Angeles became more important in terms of population than San Francisco. We may be tempted to see the rush as just a temporary boom that quickly ended, but actually it had plenty of long-term impacts, and one of them first was to really put California on the map. The population continued to increase after the boom, and California, from this forgotten place that it was before the gold rush, became an attractive place, a status that it has never lost since then. This is another story, but one thing that is really surprising in a sense with the history of California is that you could read its history since the 1840s like a succession of booms. 2 generations after the gold rush, there would be an oil boom in California. In the 20th century, the explosive development of Hollywood and the movie industry, and more recently, since the late 70s and the 80s, the boom of technology and the internet. In a sense, this gold rush and the Californian experience also modified the definition, the perception of what people call the American dream. If we come back to the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, the American dream as defined by the founders of the United States was all about individual autonomy, individual freedom, and the economic opportunity given to anyone willing to work hard to accumulate a modest fortune over time, year after year, thanks to a hard life of work. The Californian dream, with the gold rush and other booms that would follow, differs from this definition. Freedom is still here, but on the economic side, the dream becomes to turn into a rich man, a rich individual, very quickly and in a spectacular way, thanks to risk-taking, with all the good and bad consequences on the rest of the population, the rest of the society this may have. And the two definitions continue to coexist today. They are like different faces of what people call the American dream that remains something difficult to define precisely. It's very subjective and depends a lot on how people perceive the United States from within or from the outside. Okay, so I'll put, as I always do, related videos in the description. Certainly the history of Las Vegas that I mentioned before, the history of Hollywood too, and as always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you soon for a new topic. Au revoir.